If you are someone who enjoyed gaming during the 80s and 90s like I did, you probably know all about how the games back then could go overboard with things. Concepts of what is offensive and should be handled with sensitivity were not so prevalent back then, and video games could get away with just about anything. As a result, we had some of the most unhinged video game content back then that included everything from extreme graphic violence to sexually suggestive stuff. In this video, I will explore some of the most controversial games between the 70s and 90s that sparked some major debates and changed the way we look at the gaming industry. Night Trap, 1992. Night Trap was an interactive movie video game developed by Digital Pictures and published by Sega. It used full motion video to present the story and gameplay, and the player had to observe teenage girls having a sleepover in an unknown house that was infested with vampires. One had to watch the live surveillance footage and trigger traps to capture anyone who would endanger the girls. And one could switch between cameras to ensure a constant monitoring of the girls, and this included eavesdropping on their conversations and listening for clues. Once the vampires invaded because they needed blood to survive, the fate of the girls and the special agent working undercover among them rested on the creepy surveillance tactics. This was the first of its kind, and the reviews were mixed because nobody knew what to feel about such a weird concept. The B-movie-like quality was praised, and even the humor was intriguing, but the gameplay was actually rather shallow. It became so controversial for its content that Night Trap marked the principal subject of a 1993 United States Senate committee hearing on violent video games, which also included games like Lethal Enforcers and Mortal Kombat. The gratuitous violence and sexual aggression against women were viewed in bad light, and many sellers were prompted to pull the game from the shelves that December. The game designer Rob Fulop was so frustrated by all the controversies that he created a contrasting cute game called Dogs, Your Computer Pet, as a mark of his protest. There was a lot to complain about in this game, but it is true that you will never get another of its kind. Doom, 1993. The game was developed and published by id Software, and the player had to assume the role of a space marine who was referred to as the Doom Guy. The story was premised in the distant future, where a marine was posted for an assignment on Mars after he assaulted a superior officer. When a base on Phobos requested military support, the marine joined a combat force to secure Phobos. Thus, the killing spree began, and the Doom Guy had to fight through hordes of the undead humans and invading demons. The entire gameplay was quite like a cinematic experience that began on the moon of Mars and finished in Hell, and the player had to defeat the final boss in each level or find its exit. This first-person shooter was widely known for the gory and fast-paced gameplay, but the violence sometimes became a bit too much to handle. What made it even more disturbing was the fact that the violence was linked to some real-world incidents, even though they were not laid out clearly. Doom was an early example of 3D graphics in video games, and the visuals worked wonders. It was both a critical and commercial success, and it quickly became known as one of the best and most influential video games of all time as the father of first-person shooters. Many sequels followed, and even today, the franchise is just as relevant as it was back in the 90s. Doom was so addictive with the complexity of the level design and amazing graphics that I lost many hours of sleep while trying my hand at it. And no, I did not mind the violence personally. Custer's Revenge, 1982. This was a strictly adult action game that was published by American Multiple Industries for the Atari 2600. You take control of a seemingly naked character called General Custer and he had to advance through the playing field while avoiding the arrows coming his way. The goal was for him to force himself on the naked Native American woman Revenge, who was tied to a pole on the other side. There were 4 modes of play, and in modes 3 and 4, aside from the arrows, cacti appeared and disappeared at random intervals as obstacles. The content of this game was certainly not acceptable when you think of it today. As a kid, it did not occur to me how disturbing the narrative actually was. General Custer navigating to a Native American woman tied to a cactus to force himself on her was something that no modern game would dare to attempt. While it was widely criticized for its offensive content, it did become a popular hit back then. And so, PlayAround also created a gender-reversed version of the game called General Retreat. UGO.com fittingly ranked this as 10th on the list of the most racist video games in history, and many regions actually banned the game completely for being in such poor taste. Even I think that while video games shouldn't be under constant scrutiny, Custer's Revenge did overstep the boundaries a bit too much. Death Race, 1976. The 1976 arcade game Death Race is one of the earliest vehicular combat games, featuring a simple but controversial premise. Here, the player drives a car in a black and white maze-like field and attempts to run over gremlins that dart around the screen. Each time a gremlin is hit, it emits a scream and leaves behind a gravestone, which clutters the playing field and increases difficulty. There is no actual narrative or backstory in the game itself, and the gameplay centers purely on score-driven action. The game's notoriety arose from the controversy over its violent content, as many believed the gremlins resembled humans, sparking public debate about violence in video games. But within the game world, there is no developed story or lore. This arcade game was known for its morbid depiction of running over pedestrians, and it drew a lot of criticism for making it seem like a fun activity. The players could run over the greeters, depicted as stick figures, and putting all controversies aside, it was a forbidden fruit that we enjoyed as a guilty pleasure. It became the 8th highest grossing arcade game of 1976 in the US. And this popularity came even though there were multiple efforts to attack the game for facilitating violence in virtual form. Speaking strictly from the gaming perspective, Death Race had a rather enjoyable gameplay, and even the graphics were decent enough for the time. I still have fond memories of spending hours on this game, so maybe I will be forever biased about all the fun I had. Wolfenstein 3D, 1992. The protagonist of the game is an American spy of Polish descent, William Blazkowicz, and the gameplay explores his exploits in destroying the Nazi regime during World War II. He escapes from the Nazi prison castle Wolfenstein, and he then follows it up with some crucial missions against the Nazi forces. He has to fight Nazi soldiers, dogs, and other enemies with a knife and a variety of guns, and he even has an iconic battle with Adolf Hitler in a robotic suit who is equipped with 4 chain guns. This was the 3rd game in the franchise, and it quickly became a major commercial success. Regarded as one of the greatest video games ever made, the game was rightfully termed as the grandfather of 3D shooters, and the fast-paced action with the technical superiority compared to the contemporaries meant that the game had a serious fan following. Wolfenstein 3D was relatively easy to play, but that did not mean any less entertainment. Many describe the gameplay experience as frighteningly realistic, and the extremely violent graphics did not go down well with some. The gameplay was definitely not meant for the squeamish because it almost felt like you were there in the threatening environment. I loved the emotionally immersive experience, and keeping the controversies for the violence aside, this was easily one of the best games from the 90s. Carmageddon, 1997. This was an intense vehicular combat video game produced by Stainless Games and published by Interplay Productions. The gameplay was so unique that it quickly spawned an entire series. It involved the player racing a vehicle against several other computer-controlled competitors in various settings such as city, mine, and industrial areas. There was a certain amount of time allotted for the race, and more time could be gained by collecting bonuses and damaging the cars of the competitors. The gameplay even included some controversial bits like running over pedestrians. There were 36 racetracks in total, and they featured across 11 different locations. The game became so popular that it sold over 2 million copies within the next few years. Everyone was smitten by the open-ended, chaotic nature of the game, and the homicidal nature of the gameplay was the forbidden, guilty pleasure that players enjoyed. It almost felt like you were a part of some 80s B-movie action, and one really had to sweep their morals under the rug to enjoy the game that included so much of auto-homicide. The graphics of the game were not really groundbreaking, but they were not too bad either. Also, the controls could be frustrating at times, especially till the time you got a proper hang of the game. Many groups tried to raise the concerns around the violence in the game, but clearly, it never affected the insane popularity of Carmageddon. The sequels soon followed, but I still remember the original for the thrill of the gameplay, even with the questionable elements. Phantasmagoria, 1995. This was a popular point-and-click adventure horror game during the mid-90s, and it was designed by Roberta Williams and released by Sierra Online. The story is about a writer named Adrienne Delaney who moves into a secluded mansion, and soon she is terrorized by some supernatural forces. It starts with nightmares that she experiences after moving in, and even her loving husband Don Gordon cannot fix the situation. Slowly, Adrienne makes some startling discoveries about the place, and it turns out that the previous owner practiced black magic and summoned an evil demon back in his time. Over the years, the mansion hid some sinister secrets, and it is up to Adrienne to survive the threats and get out of this alive. When Phantasmagoria was released, the interactive movie games were gaining in popularity, and even this game featured live-action actors and footage to add to the realistic effect. While the game was fun in general, the violence and sexual content soon came under a lot of scrutiny. It was still the best-selling computer in the US, and the sales numbers were insane. It was clearly a smart move to capture the adult market that was looking for such sophisticated games, and many described this gameplay as an experience that was as close to a film as it could get. There were some suspenseful twists and horrifying moments, and it was a wild ride to remember. Of course, the spooky musical score added to the ambiance of the gameplay, and it did become slightly overwhelming at times. The visuals were frighteningly realistic, and the well-produced game ensured I had a lot of recurring nightmares back in the day. Thrillkill, 1998. Thrillkill came with a pretty unique plot that involved 10 people who get sent to hell after dying on Earth and were forced by the goddess of secrets to fight to the death for a chance at reincarnation. Each of the players received a kill meter that increased with every successful attack, and when filled, it executed a gory finishing move called a Thrillkill. The gameplay featured 4 opponents who would fight to kill one another by using these gory special moves. Even though it began as a sports-based video game, the developers were pushed to make things more violent. Soon, it was turned into an adult-oriented BDSM-themed fighting game, and it quickly gained a following because of its overtly sexual and gory content. The game received one of the first ever adults-only ratings from the Entertainment Software Rating Board, and many demanded a complete ban on the game for the suggestive bits. Unfortunately, even though the beta version was considered to be a lot of fun, it was stopped from being released even though pirating websites got hold of the bootleg versions. It became even more popular because of the cancellation, and the game elements were later remodeled to create the 1999 video game Wu-Tang Shaolin style. I don't remember so much talk around a canceled game before, so you can imagine how this was such a big deal back then. Raid Over Moscow, 1984. In Raid Over Moscow, the player takes the role of an American space pilot responding to a sudden Soviet nuclear missile attack on North America. With regular defenses dismantled by disarmament, the US relies on secret space planes. The player scrambles jets from an orbiting space station, navigating through Soviet defenses to reach and destroy heavily protected missile silos in cities like Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and Saratov before their warheads reach US targets. After thwarting these attacks, the mission escalates to a dramatic ground assault on Moscow, where the player must blast into and sabotage the Kremlin's nuclear reactor, ultimately preventing global catastrophe and saving the world from annihilation. The nature of the game and the narrative made sure that it soon became a subject of great controversy. A member of the Finnish parliament even raised the question about whether it was acceptable to sell this game, and the debates increased the popularity of the game even further and turned it into a bestseller. This game by Access Software was ahead of its time in terms of the gameplay, and even the graphics were much better than the usual video games from the 80s. Aside from the graphics and sound, the general Cold War theme mixed with the tension during the time made it an instant hit with the gamers. There were complaints about how the game caused stress and mental health issues in young minds, but I had none, and I played this game quite a bit during the time. 177, 1986. This highly controversial Japanese video game was released in 1986 by Macadamia Soft for the PC 8801 and PC 9801 systems. The game, named after the Japanese legal code prohibiting rape, puts the player in control of Hideo Uchi, a 26-year-old man who obsesses over and stalks a young woman named Kotoe Saito. Across two gameplay acts, players first chase Kotoe through side-scrolling levels, using obstacles, bombs, and trick detours to slow her down and remove articles of her clothing each time she is caught. If the player ultimately catches her, the game shifts to a graphic sex simulation minigame, where the player's objective is to satisfy her. If successful, the narrative declares Kotoe marries her attacker, but if not, the protagonist is arrested. The narrative of the game was such that it was only normal for the title to run into a major public outcry, given how the central theme was based around rape. There were some other sexually focused Japanese video games, and 177 merely followed the trend to enjoy the success. It was even marketed as a sex manual for couples, but all the efforts were challenged by the House of Representatives, where political advisors were strictly against the theme of the game. I have never played this game, but going by the general reviews, it was indeed a despicable idea that promoted all the wrong perversions. Maybe it is for the best that the game never properly reached the American audience.
Prepare to die.
Barbarian, The Ultimate Warrior, 1987. This has to be one of the most brutal fighting games from the 80s, and it supports 1 or 2 players. You can take the role of sword-wielding barbarians who fight in various locales. The head-to-head mode allows the player to fight another opponent or the computer in time-limited matches, and there is also a single-player story mode, which requires the player to move through a series of challenges set by an evil wizard in order to rescue a bikini-wearing princess Mariana. The protagonist goes by the name Gorth in the US version of the game, and once the wizard is defeated, Mariana drops at her savior's feet and the screen fades to black. Even before the game was properly released, the advertisements triggered some outcries of moral indignation. A few religious bodies and groups called the image offensive and insulting to women, and there were efforts to censor the game because it was in bad taste. Some called this a controversy magnet that did not have any real substance. The violence was also rather unhinged, from decapitations to violent kills. All this got the game banned in Germany, but the gorehounds were impressed by the gameplay and the fast and furious action. The graphics were quite impressive, and the detailing of the fight sequences made it all the more engaging. There was even a spiritual successor released more than 2 decades later called Age of Barbarian, and back when the original game was released during the 80s, it was one of the most popular games of the time. Chiller, 1986. Chiller was an exciting light gun arcade game released by Exidy, and the game narrative had you take on the role of an unseen torturer. The goal of the game was to maim, mutilate, and murder the restrained non-player characters, and there were a variety of dungeon settings to add to the creepy ambiance of the gameplay. Some of these characters could even fight back, and thus, it was quite a challenge to find innovative ways that lead to the character's death as quickly as possible. There were 4 main levels: the torture chamber, the rack room, the haunted house hallway, and the graveyard. And even a final bonus round could be unlocked. The game featured some medieval torture devices, and the player had to figure out how to kill the characters in the shortest time possible. As you can imagine, the concept did not go down too well with the censor police, and the morbid violence was heavily criticized. The gameplay featured certain gory details, such as chunks of flesh being blown away when shot, and some very disturbing and bloody deaths. After the first 2 levels, the game transitioned into a more traditional shooting game, but it was already enough to trigger those who condemn the graphic violence. Arcade owners refused to purchase the game, and it did not have much success in the US. Although I haven't tried my hand at this one myself, I have to admit that the concept is quite intriguing. Duke Nukem 3D, 1996. Duke Nukem was an interesting first-person shooter concept that was developed by 3D Realms and published by FormGen. It served as the sequel to Duke Nukem and Duke Nukem 2, and the narrative featured the adventures of the titular Duke Nukem, who fought against an alien invasion on Earth. The story was featured in the 21st century, and the narrative that picked up after the events of Duke Nukem 2 referenced the popular films like Aliens, Evil Dead 2, Full Metal Jacket, Pulp Fiction, They Live, and several other sci-fi and action classics. The contribution of Duke Nukem 3D in popularizing first-person shooter games is undeniable, and it is right up there among the ranks of Doom and Quake. While the violence was condemned by some sections, the game received mostly favorable reviews. The gamers loved the gameplay and level designs, and I was a huge fan of the unique risque humor in the narrative that had a hint of a pop culture satire. It was also fun to explore the interactivity of the environments, and even the sound effects and music were pretty solid. The erotic elements and portrayal of women in the game did incite a few controversies, but the gaming industry still regards this as one of the greatest video games of all time. Yes, many of us played the censored version of the game, and many countries banned its release, but it will always remain one of my childhood classics. Kingpin, Life of Crime, 1999. This was the late 90s, and the world of video games had become quite advanced by now. Kingpin, Life of Crime was a first-person shooter developed by Zatrix Entertainment that popularized the genre even further. It was set in a quasi-retro time period, and the story revolved around crime and criminals. Things started off in a dystopian city where the player character was beaten up by some thugs who worked for Nicky Blanco, one of the Kingpin's prime henchmen. The beating was supposed to be a warning, but it ended up becoming a motivation for revenge as the character rose to prominence through the underworld to get back at those who had wronged him. The game was a beautifully depicted metropolitan nightmare with all the right story elements. It was an incredible achievement in terms of the advanced graphics, and the excellent level designs and advanced NPC interaction had everyone's attention. There was more than enough action and shocking moments to keep your interest, and even the soundtrack was fitting. While the game was thoroughly enjoyable, it did receive some backlash for the graphic depiction of violence and heavy use of profanities. This was the time when video games were facing increasing pressure from Congress and lobby groups, and there were calls made to cancel the game. However, the controversies only made the game more popular, and the amazing gameplay only helped the fans surge. Personally, I loved how the game felt like a complete mafia movie, and it was certainly worth spending hours on my computer. Super Monaco GP 1989. If you shared a love for racing games back in the day, chances are that you are familiar with Super Monaco GP, the Formula One racing simulation video game that was released by Sega. It was actually a sequel to the 1979 arcade game Monaco GP, but it was a major improvement. The game provided a simulation of the Monaco Grand Prix, and the players had to qualify for the race around a short circuit before they actually got to the main race. If one failed to complete a lap before the 45-second timer, the game would be over, and you needed all your skills to ace this one. This arcade classic became an instant hit with the racing fans, and it was particularly successful in the Asian and European markets. The best part about the game was how realistic it all felt, and everything from the graphics to the arcade cabinet experience was top-notch. It was more on the difficult side, but you could always master your skills to come out on top. The game never felt sluggish, and even though the concept lost its innovation with a wide assortment of racing games, it remained as one of the best of the decade. The console version of the game did have a few flaws in the controls, but nothing major enough to jeopardize the popularity. Overall, it was a complete racing game before the likes of NFS and Asphalt stole the show in the genre. SimCopter 1996. I was a big fan of this game, simply because it allowed me to fulfill my dreams of becoming a helicopter pilot. For the user mode of SimCopter, you could fly around cities, and the building part was also very interesting. As for the career mode, the player had to pilot a helicopter for various jobs around a city. There were some fun adventures like picking up a police officer from the roof of a police station and dropping him near the criminal to be apprehended. From managing traffic jams and fires and rescues, the game offered enough diversity in the gameplay to keep one engaged, and one could complete missions to earn money and points. The game invited one of the funniest controversies that I ever heard about, when it was discovered that the designer had inserted an Easter egg where shirtless men in Speedo trunks hugged and kissed each other. This was later removed from the future copies, and it turned out that the designer was simply getting his revenge for the extremely stressful work hours. As for the technicalities, the graphics were fluid and colorful, even though they could have been visualized better. The visuals in general were not the best in business, but the tongue-in-cheek humor made up for the shortcomings. I also appreciated the well-executed sound, and the solid action-packed gameplay with all the helicopter controlling made this one of my favorites. The Great Giana Sisters, 1987. The Great Giana Sisters is a platform video game where you play as Giana, a young girl who finds herself in a strange, dreamlike world after falling asleep. In her dream, she must journey through many colorful, side-scrolling levels filled with obstacles, enemies, and hidden treasures. Giana collects magic crystals for points and power-ups to help her survive. The main goal is to reach the end of each level, while avoiding dangers and defeating enemies. Giana is searching for her lost sister, Maria, and hopes to reunite with her and escape the bizarre dream world. The adventure ends when Giana finally finds her sister and wakes up, ending her surreal dream adventure. Those who have enjoyed Commodore 64 will enjoy this one because it was easily the greatest Commodore 64 games ever. When the game was released, Nintendo sued the company that created Giana Sisters because it was close to Nintendo's Mario Brothers. Even though this affected the title, it was still one of the most popular pirated games back in the day. For me, the best bit about the great Giana Sisters is that it still takes me back to the happy 80s. Everything from the graphics to the music was handled just right, and even though the controls required some getting used to, it was worth the acquired skills. Yes, there were some repetitive bits in the game, but it did leave behind a legacy that is remembered even today. International Karate, 1985. This game has some historic value because it marked the first European-developed game that became a major hit in the US, selling over 1.5 million copies. The core game was a two-dimensional one-on-one versus fighting game. The players took on the roles of martial artists competing in a tournament. Here, the goal was to land some solid hits, and the points mattered in determining the winner. In the single-player mode, one could move through the difficulty levels from the novice white belts to master black belts. Even though the game was widely popular, Epyx was sued by video game publisher Data East for infringement of copyright, trademark, and trade dress. This was because of the 1984 arcade game Karate Champ, and the similarities between these two games were quite obvious. However, the court dismissed most of the allegations and only found Epyx guilty of infringing upon Data East's USA copyright. Later, the decision to recall all copies of the game was reversed, and honestly, it did not matter to the gamers who were enjoying the all-out action thoroughly. It was a rather original Karate Champ clone, and overall, it was an excellent game that deserved all the love and attention. Fighter's History, 1993. Fighter's History begins with 9 fighters from around the world entering a martial arts tournament to prove who is the strongest. Players select a character and battle through successive one-on-one matches, ultimately facing 2 powerful bosses: Clown, a circus-themed fighter, and Karnov, the tournament's mysterious sponsor, who is also the protagonist of Data East's earlier action game. The game stands out for its weak point system, where hitting an opponent's highlighted weak spot, like a piece of clothing, results in temporary stun and increased damage for the rest of the round. Despite strong resemblances to Street Fighter II, Fighter's History became known for its distinctive mechanics and quirky competitors, earning a cult following and continued legacy in fighting game history. It even earned a lawsuit when Capcom USA sued Data East Corp over the similarities with Street Fighter II, but Capcom lost the case on grounds that the copied elements were scenes of fare and excluded from copyright. Overall, it was a fun game to play back in the times when arcade experiences were getting better by the day. Gotcha 73. Gotcha, released by Atari, is one of the earliest arcade maze games and centers on a simple cat-and-mouse premise. One player, the pursuer, a square, chases the other, the pursued, a plus sign, through a continually shifting maze with the goal of catching them before time runs out. The game emits faster beeping sounds as the pursuer closes in, building tension, and only the pursuer earns points by making contact, resetting both players' positions in the maze. Notorious for its original arcade cabinet, Gotcha sparked controversy by featuring pink rubber domes as controls that were meant to represent breasts, a provocative design quickly replaced by standard joysticks. While the gameplay was straightforward and ahead of its time as an early maze chase game, it was the risque cabinet design and marketing that secured its legacy as one of the video game industry's first scandals. It was not much of a commercial success, and sources suggested that it sold only around 3,000 units. Even as the first arcade maze video game, it never got the commercial presence that it deserved. I love the gameplay, and maybe if it was marketed well enough, it could have broken a few records during the time. Marvelous verdict. Controversies did always mean poor quality video games. Almost every single video game that you came across in this video courted some form of controversy because of the content, but the graphic violence, sexually suggestive visuals, and other offensive stuff did not necessarily mean that the games were of poor quality. Yes, some items on this list were just cash grab attempts, looking to exploit the controversies for public interest, but most of them were really fun games with a massive fan following. Also, some of these video games were pioneers in their genre, introducing new ideas and gameplays that were later utilized for some of the most popular video games ever created. Thus, you can despise these games all you want, but you cannot really ignore them. Do let me know in the comments below which one of these games you are familiar with, and also tell us about your favorite ones from the list.